There's only 5 of us on this camping trip. We keep counting 6. There were bright flashes of red in the sky. It's as if someone was waving around a flare light from space, faint but noticeable. We all made UFO jokes and laughed as we nailed our tents into the ground. I knew for sure that there were 5 of us. We have all been friends since early middle school, and we're celebrating our high school graduation with this getaway camping trip. The flashes of red must have stopped randomly as we made conversation while fixing up our tents. Dave managed to put his tent together the fastest and told us he was going to find some branches for the fire. I remember how he had worked with me at the local gas station last year. We used to do the night shift together, and it had made working at a desolate gas station much more fun than it was supposed to be. There was also Eric in the corner still reading his tent manual, fidgeting with his signature round glasses. I wasn't as close with Eric as I was with the others, but I still remember sitting with him in math class and copying his homework one time. Ava was also there talking with Sally, my cousin. Both had decided to team up and work on one tent at a time. I also have clear memories of them, hanging around at school in our usual places. In fact, I even knew Ava's younger brother, as he used to beg to go with us wherever we went. I bring all this up because I'm sure that there were 5 of us, including me, and that I knew everyone in the group. So Dave had went to get some branches as we pulled out some foldable chairs and set them up around the fire pit. I remember feeling uneasy as the sun set and darkness began to consume the forest. The shadows of trees elongated around us as the minutes ticked by. Eric went to get a flashlight from his bag while we wondered what was taking Dave so long. He appeared soon after, the harsh rustling sounds of the bushes signifying his return. We were all buried in our chairs at this point, covered by our jackets. The temperature had dropped quickly and a slight breeze was beginning to pick up. "Geez, you guys weren't even bothered to pull out a chair for me," Dave said as he arranged all the branches in the pit. We had set up 5 chairs around the fire. I tried to rationalize the situation, but no matter how hard I focused, my head felt like it was underwater. I had perfect clarity up until that moment, but when I tried to focus on why 5 chairs were occupied when Dave hadn't sat down yet, my head seemed to just stop working, as if something was reaching in and pulling out my thoughts. Instinctually, I felt even more uneasy now, and I had placed why. The whole forest had gone dead silent. I looked around at the faces of the others and could tell that they had felt the same. Eric was fidgeting with his fingers, trying to scan around the group and spot the extra person, but it was futile. I scanned every face, each etched in worry and frowning in frustration except for... "It's... all right, I'll get the chair myself," Dave said, breaking the silence and somewhat alleviating the tension. I got up and offered to help him. He looked into my eyes and nodded knowingly. We headed away from the fire pit towards the tents, but I kept my eyes glued on our group. "How many people are here?" I whispered to Dave as he looked around and realized that we had indeed only packed 5 chairs. In fact, every person had brought with them their own chair. They were heavy to carry, and we wouldn't bring any extra needlessly. "There's 5, right? I mean, there's 5 chairs," Dave replied. His voice wavered as he spoke. "No, I just think maybe one of us forgot our chair," I said. My mind was struggling to address the issue head-on, and now sought to find rational excuses instead. I didn't quite feel in control of my thoughts. It felt like swimming in a dream, and if I tried to force myself to think about who the 6th person was, my head would begin to throb. "Yeah, that sounds about right, actually," Dave said, relaxing and heading back to the group. When we walked back to the fire pit and circle of chairs, 2 chairs were empty, one for me and one for Dave. Everything was adding up now, even though we all agreed it wasn't before. Sally suggested we were all probably tired after the long hike to get here and probably just needed some sleep. She could have been right. We were all sleep-deprived from waking up very early today to make it on time. Ava brought out the drinks. The whole 6-pack was emptied. We all moved closer to the crackling fire for warmth as we took sips from our cans and reminisced on memories of last year. Ava was in the middle of telling us about that one time she was home alone with weird things happening in her house when I got these sudden chills despite the pleasant warmth of the fire. What felt cozy and safe moments ago felt wrong now, all because I realized that there was a crucial detail I missed. "Who started the fire?" I asked, completely interrupting Ava in the middle of her story and breaking everyone else's immersion. Everyone looked momentarily annoyed until they realized they had no answer. Once again I scanned the faces staring back at me, all barely illuminated by the light from the fire, all familiar and pale from fear. "Wasn't it you, Dave?" Eric asked. Dave shook his head. "I think the person standing behind Jenny did it," Sally said, looking over at me. I whipped my head around so quickly it hurt. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was nothing behind me except for the encompassing darkness of the woods. Staring at those tall, dark trees behind me made me feel exposed. I felt like a lost bird in a vast field. "Wait, I don't know," Sally said. Her eyes had gone wide and she was shaking visibly. She continued to look around frantically as Ava moved over to her, placing her hands on her shoulders and trying to calm her down. "I think we should leave this place," Ava stuttered. "Yeah, something just doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on it," Dave said. "But it's so dark out in the forest now. We'd probably get lost if we leave now," someone else said. "Yeah, I think we should stay the night and leave as soon as we can tomorrow," Eric agreed. I tried to protest but realized Eric was right. The woods harbored an oppressive darkness within which navigation would be near impossible. "Let's not sleep in our separate tents just to be safe," Sally said. We all agreed. We only brought one-person tents with us, but we could squeeze two if we tried. That way, no one would be alone at night. Following this conversation, we all got up and made our pairs. I went with Dave and Sally like always went with Ava. Eric kept complaining that he didn't have a pair, but we reassured him he did. He wouldn't accept it. I feel like at some point we all realized that there were only 5 of us, and suddenly we were all huddling up in the middle of the clearing. "Why do we keep thinking there are 6 of us here?" Eric asked. Sweat was dripping down his face despite the cold. We had nearly left him all alone on his own under the assumption that there was another person. My stomach turned as I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to mentally recap everyone here. My head throbbed, but I kept pushing it. "There's me, Dave, Eric, Ava, Sally, and..." I was pointing at each of them as I said the name. I retched and emptied the contents of my stomach on the ground when I got past Sally. The left side of my head felt like there was a knife stuck in it. My vision was blurry. Dave held me up to stop me from collapsing, and we all wordlessly started to move towards the tents as someone put the fire out. Dave helped me into a tent while the 4 outside discussed what to do. I could only focus on snippets of the conversation as the excruciating pain beating against my skull came and went in waves. Sally had the brilliant idea of arranging 3 tents together so their openings faced together at right angles in a sort of U shape so we could sleep as close as possible and also limit the entrance to our tents. Dave was about to go to help as they worked outside, but I clutched his hand and asked him to stay with me. The tents took some time to arrange. I started to feel a bit better once everyone got settled into their tents. A quick head count confirmed there were 5 of us. Eric would have to sleep in his tent alone, but he was more comfortable with it since all the tents were very close now. Looking back now, I think he was just trying to put a brave face on for us. I regret that moment deeply, letting him sleep in his tent alone. He was always less integrated in our group and knew that none of us would pair with him. Just before going to bed, we all agreed to leave as soon as the sun rose in the morning. I remember taking one last look outside the tent into the forest before trying to fall asleep. The wind had picked up and the tree branches were swaying gently. Beyond our clearing was just pure darkness. It felt like the trees were closing in on me. With the faint moonlight illuminating our clearing, I turned my head to look over at the 2 tents we had left out and saw someone standing next to them. Despite the circumstances, sleep came quickly and easily. Ava's shrill scream woke me up in the middle of the night. Dave and I ripped our tent door open to find Sally and Ava looking into Eric's tent. We pushed them aside. Eric's sleeping bag was rolled up. He was still inside it, his head in the center, face contorted in utter agony. The rest of his body rolled around it with the blue fabric now dripping with dark blood. Dave zipped up the door of the tent. Ava was in shock. Her eyes had become glassy and unfocused. Sally was shaking her repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Dave picked up his torch and yelled at us to get up and run. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The five of us huddled together, Dave leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. All we had to help us get through this 2-hour trail was a small white circle of light. Even the moon failed to illuminate our surroundings through the dense foliage. Ava tripped and fell, twisting her ankle. We came to a stop. Someone said they knew how to splint it so we could keep going. They dragged her into the woods instead. It happened too quickly for any of us to process. Sally was about to run after Ava when Dave held her back. She struggled and managed to free herself, running into the trees to follow the echoes of Ava's screams. I was about to run after her, but Dave held me by the shoulders and shook me hard. "We need to get out of here, Jenny, please," he said. I hesitated but jolted into motion again when Sally's voice was cut off abruptly. She had been calling out Ava's name as she ran after her. Dave and I continued to run down the trail, trying to get to our car so we could get out of here. There was nothing we could do. At some point there were 3 of us running on the trail, Dave and I shoulder to shoulder, while someone followed us closely behind. "Dave, who's behind us?" I gasped. My heart was threatening to burst through my ribcage and my legs burned. He turned to look at me. Confusion transformed into fear on his face and then into rage. "You keep running," he told me as he produced a pocket knife from his pants. He handed me the car keys, which I nearly dropped. Then he turned around suddenly and jumped at whoever was behind us. I continued to run in fear as the sounds of a struggle grew behind me. I tripped and tumbled through the trail for what felt like hours. I didn't allow myself to stop. I almost cried when the trail ended, and I walked out into the familiar car park. Not wasting a second, I ran to the car and started it up, accelerating out of that forest and onto the highway within mere seconds. I'm typing this post out at a rest stop. My phone has finally regained service and I've called 911 to try and explain the situation. I don't think they believe my version of events, but they sent a car my way regardless. As I wait, the sun is finally starting to rise. After I hit the post button on this, I'm going to check why the person in my back seat has been so silent the whole time. 20 years ago. Me and my son went on a camping trip. Now I wonder if he ever came back. I remember it really clearly. It was about 20 years ago, back when we lived in Washington. My wife was never the outdoorsy type, so when my son Brandon wanted to go camping, it was always just me and him. That wasn't bad though, it was good father-son time. It was a nice scenic drive on the way to the campsite. I remember Brandon asked me about the music on the radio, and I spent an embarrassingly long time reminiscing about my high school days and what bands I was obsessed with back then. Eventually we reached our site and I got to work pitching our tent. Brandon waited patiently. He wasn't the type to go running off or anything, and when it was all set up, me and him went for a hike to take in the nature. It was really peaceful. The woods surrounding the campground were calm and serene. There wasn't any animals out and about, but every once in a while I would stop and point out a deer track or some droppings. It reminded me of when I was a kid spending time with my dad. I suppose I was about 9 years old when I learned about the marvels of deer poop myself. As I looked at him, I couldn't help but see a younger version of myself. We had the same eyes, the same hair, and like most of the people in my family, we had the same birthmark on our upper right arm. It was hard spending time with Brandon sometimes. I worked so often, and sure, it was putting food on the table. But whenever I saw how fast he was growing without me around, the guilt would start to well up inside me. Seeing him smile and laugh that day really uplifted my spirits, though. I was here now, and that's what mattered, is what I'd tell myself whenever the conversation lulled. As we were walking, we suddenly found the trail leading out of the woods and into a beautiful view of the river. I was telling Brandon about erosion and how you could see the effects of the previous year's floods on the riverbank when his expression suddenly changed. He pointed up to the sky and said, "What's that, Dad?" I looked up myself and found that I was just as confused as he was. There was, off in the distance, a dark, triangular-looking object. It hung in the sky perfectly still, and then suddenly vanished. Not wanting to lose my reputation as a know-it-all dad, I desperately searched for an explanation before deciding that it must have been a helicopter and telling Brandon as such. He obviously didn't believe me, and frankly, I didn't believe myself either. By the time we got back to our tent, the sun had already started to set. I got Brandon to help me collect some firewood and start up a fire. We roasted some hot dogs and marshmallows. We didn't get to the scary stories, however, as Brandon started nodding off and I decided it was time for bed. I got Brandon into his sleeping bag and I crawled into mine right beside him. It was the shaking that woke me at first. I had been in an earthquake before, but this was different. It was hard to describe. It was almost like someone was picking up the earth and the earth was trying to pull it back. I was still groggy. I reached out to see if Brandon was awake and I found his sleeping bag empty. I wasn't too panicked yet. Like I said, he wasn't the type to run off, and I always try to keep a level head. I stumbled out of the tent and walked towards where the flashlights were, confident that I would find him near the fire trying to cope with the shaking. Then the lights happened. The whole campground was bathed in a bright, sickly white light. It was blinding at first, and when my vision adjusted, I realized that Brandon was nowhere to be found. That was when I started to panic. I grabbed a flashlight and started shouting his name. As I ran to the edge of the woods surrounding the campsite, I tried looking for a source for the light, but I couldn't see one. As I ran to the edge of the woods, my pounding heart skipped a beat when I heard Brandon's voice. He called out to me, "Dad, I'm over here!" I rushed over. My happiness quickly abated when he started crying, "Help! Something's wrong!" I ran to the other side of the campsite and found him crouched away from me in a little ditch. The shaking had mostly subsided and I rushed over to him. He was facing away from the light and I put my hand on his back. "What's the matter? Are you hurt?" I could hear him struggling for air. "Dad," he finally cried. "Something's wrong. Everything's wrong." His voice was weak. I reached to his hand and when I touched it, alarm bells rang in my head. His skin was rubbery and wrinkly, like a Halloween mask. I turned my flashlight on and his whole skin looked a horrid purple. "Brandon," I muttered in shock. I turned him to face me and screamed. His face was emaciated, his eyes so sunken they looked like a skull's empty sockets. His jaw hanged open like the muscles that held it were worn and worthless. My whole body shook in terror. The shaking started back up again, this time even more violently. It seemed as if the ground was going to get ripped up and thrown into the sky. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed Brandon and held him as close to me as I could. I found myself praying to a God I was never sure actually existed. Through gurgles and moans, Brandon started to talk. "It hurts, Dad. Why does it hurt so much? Help me, Dad." As I squeezed him, I could feel him get thinner and thinner, like his insides were being sucked out. It felt like there was nothing left of him. Tears started rolling down my face, and the last thing I heard him say, faint as a whisper, haunted me. "Why won't you help me, Dad?" A nudge caused me to bolt up in my sleeping bag. Brandon was prodding me. "Wake up, Dad. I'm hungry." I got up, more than a little confused. As my heart stopped racing and I came back to reality, I realized that I had just had a crazy nightmare. I chuckled to myself. After Brandon was fed, I walked over to the ditch from the previous night. There was nothing weird or out of the ordinary. Brandon, too, seemed just like he always was, and didn't mention anything about the previous night. When I walked back to Brandon and asked if he felt the ground shake, he said he hadn't felt a thing. When we got back to civilization, I asked other people the same thing, and they all agreed with Brandon. For a week then, my mind was at ease. I worked a lot again that week, and when I finally had a day off, me and the wife took Brandon to the pool. It was only there that memories of that night came flooding back and the horror with it. When Brandon took his shirt off, I looked at his arm and noticed the family birthmark was missing. If you ever hear a cry for help at night while camping, ignore it. I love to camp, but after my most recent trip, I don't think it will ever be the same. I set up my tent on nice, flat ground and collected some wood for a fire. The night came with all its nightly sounds, and I relaxed at the hooting owls and chirping crickets. Even better was the fact that no one else was around. "Help!" It was subtle. I almost missed it. The voice came from deep within the woods, and for a moment I didn't believe what I was hearing. It sounded female, but oddly enough, I just couldn't tell. "Please help," it continued. I shined my flashlight between the bushes and walked around. To be completely honest, even as a grown man, I was paralyzed with fear. So I did the responsible thing and called the local police. That's when things went from odd to very, very weird. The police told me to ignore it. I explained to them that someone could be injured and probably needed medical attention, but they assured me otherwise. When I kept pushing and asked why, they told me, "Sir, if you ever hear that voice again, ignore it. Do not respond and do not approach." Well, I did hear it again, but I didn't ignore it. It was almost midnight when I heard the voice a second time. I awoke to someone whispering help, and it sounded like she was just outside my tent. I went out to check and no one was there, but the voice continued from a distance. "Help, please." Again, I grabbed my flashlight and looked around the area I was camping. I was too afraid to follow the voice into the woods, especially since the authorities themselves avoided it. But I struggled morally, trying to decide whether I should go and help this person or listen to the police, who were concerned for my safety. But then I heard another, different voice. This other voice, which also seemed to be coming from the woods, was an octave lower. Unlike the first one, which cried for help, this one was loud and demanding. "Quiet," the other voice demanded. "No one's going to help you." Once I heard that, I was sure someone was in trouble. I called the police again. When I informed them about a second voice coming from the woods, they seemed even more concerned. They told me that I should pack my things and leave the campsite immediately. They said that hearing the second, more manly voice meant that it was getting desperate. They also said that the two voices were coming from the same person. That part was bizarre and confused me, to say the least. It was at this point I dismissed the police in that area as crazy, but not before telling them off. I got angry. I told them that if they didn't get down here to come and check it out, then I would do it myself. I said repeatedly that a woman could be in serious trouble and that it was their duty to help her, but still they refused to come. All they kept repeating to me over the phone was, "Do not enter the woods, sir." They seemed more afraid than I was. Once I hung up the phone, I heard the voices again. A gentle, "Please, somebody help me." And then a growling, "Quiet, no one's coming." It was a little past midnight at that point. I couldn't live with myself knowing that I had the chance to save someone's life, but instead cowered. So I grabbed some things and ventured into the woods. When I entered the woods, the voices ceased. Just like that. No cries, no whispers, and no commands. Even the owls and crickets went away. Nothing but dancing leaves and creaking tree branches. I stopped walking and looked around, a full 360 degrees. "Hello? Anyone here?" I called out. Nothing. "I'm here to help," I continued. "Where are you? Are you okay?" Still nothing. I thought of calling the police again, then chuckled to myself. I found it strange but somewhat comforting that I didn't find anyone out there. Nonetheless, I was still creeped out, so I packed my things and finally left the campsite. I didn't know why the police, of all people, were so afraid. Worst case, someone was in actual danger, and we've all failed them. Best case, morons who think saying, "Help me," in the middle of nowhere is a great idea for a prank. To be honest, when I heard the voice the very first time, I did think it was a joke. When I heard it the second time, along with that other voice, I became a bit more concerned. And same with the third time I heard it in the woods. But when I heard it again a fourth time, a week after I left the campsite, coming from inside my own house, I became very, very concerned. We ignored all the warning signs while camping and paid the price. There is nothing to do in my town. If the internet had never been invented, I would have gotten stuck hanging out at the local coffee shop, desperate to fill my time. I have access to unlimited entertainment and information at my fingertips, and yet I still can't find answers about what happened last summer. I'm more of an indoor person. Somehow my friend Kenny dragged me along on a camping trip with his brother and my childhood friend. We all grew up together. Kenny's brother was 2 years older, so it felt like we never really connected. I didn't dislike him. We just didn't have anything in common. My best friend was the prettiest girl in the country, and I think she knew it. I had been in love with her since we were 13, but I'd never admitted it to her. I know the movement I did, our relationship would change. I was scared she might reject my feelings or accept them. Just being friends suits me just fine. The only way to get me outside was if Mila was going to be there. I think Kenny and Darren knew that. I refused to go on the camping trip. They asked Mila to come along, and they told me she would be with us. I hated how easily they played me. It was a hot day. All of us were sweating by the time we arrived at the campsite. "Can we set up the tents after?" Kenny said as he let all the bags drop from his shoulders. "No, let's get it done now, or else we won't get to it on time." I told him no matter how much I wanted to put it off. I knew him. The last trip he and his brother took, they were too lazy to set up the tents and just slept outside in their sleeping bags. They came home covered in bug bites. I didn't want a repeat of that. They both groaned and listened to me. Mila and I worked on one tent while the brothers set up the other. "There are only 2 tents," I pointed out. "We've shared tents before," she replied, not looking up. If she had, she would have seen how red my face got. At least I could blame the sunny weather for my flushed cheeks. Kenny decided to toss a full water bottle at Darren, but missed. It hit me upside the back of my head, and I needed to go over to them to roughhouse for a little bit. Mile crossed her arms, amused by us. I got my ass handed to me, like always. As I got back up off the ground from the play fight, I noticed something white flash between the trees. I was about to mention it, but the color was gone as fast as I noticed it. We had picked a campsite that wasn't that popular with the locals, but that didn't mean there wasn't anyone else in the woods. We finally got the campsite set up, tents ready, food put away in case of any animals, and firewood gathered. Once that was all set, we started to head down the path that led to the lake. We all earned a long swim. Kenny and Darren walked ahead of us, and I helped Mila down the rough pathway. "Should we really be camping right now?" Mila asked loud enough for Kenny to hear. "Wasn't there a big search recently?" I heard a little about that. Kenny chimed in to explain what happened. 4 campers high on shrooms walked into the woods and no one found any traces of them. "It was 3 weeks ago, so I don't think we'll come across a feral lost camper," he said with a shrug. It was a bit heartless to imply those 4 were dead. He was right, though. Those 4 didn't have a good chance of still being around after dealing with this summer heat for 3 weeks. "Just in case, let's not go out in the woods alone tonight," I told them, suddenly feeling a chill even though I was sweating. "Is that your fetish? You like watching us pee?" Kenny teased. "I think he likes watching number 2, no free shows," Darren added. "Kinda weird how fast you guys thought of that. Almost like it was on your mind," I replied. "I've dealt with these guys for years. I expected the dumbest things to come out of their mouth." Mila giggled at us. I wondered why she put up with 3 morons. The lake wasn't as cool as I hoped. The water was nice and it did help with the heat, but I almost wished I was at home with the AC on full blast. Whenever I saw Mila in her black one-piece swimsuit and swim trunks, the thought of Ack went out of my mind. I kept forcing my eyes away from her, so she didn't know how much of a creep I was. I really needed to get a grip on myself. "Hey, do you see that?" I asked Kenny when he swam over to me. He wrapped an arm around my neck to playfully drag me under, but stopped when I spoke. He followed my line of sight into the woods, trying to spot what I was staring at. "Is that a person?" he asked, squinting. Soon Darren and Mila were looking in the same direction. A white shape was between 2 trees on the other side of the lake. It did look like a person, but it was impossible to tell at that distance. It was too still to be a person, and yet it didn't sway in the breeze as if it was a discarded shirt or some trash. "Let's go and see," Kenny said as he let go of my neck. He started to swim away, and Mila came up next to me. "What do you think it is?" she asked. When I'd taken my eyes off the trees, and to her, the white object moved. Kenny stopped swimming when he realized what we had been looking at was gone. "Probably some old pervert watching a tasty little thing swim around shirtless," Kenny said with a splash. "He's implying the old pervert is watching you," Darren finished with a smile. I slapped the water in his face. Soon the white shape had been forgotten about as we got into a water fight. I kept glancing back into the trees. The white shape didn't return, and I assumed it had been nothing after all. We started heading back to the campsite when the sky turned a slight orange. Kenny and Darren chanted the entire way back about the beans they were going to cook and eat. I was glad I was not sharing a tent with them tonight. When we did get back, they discovered that somehow they left the bag that held the coveted beans back in the truck. Mila also forgot her socks and a few other things, so she wanted to go back with them. I didn't feel like walking, so I volunteered to stay behind to get the fire started. They had been gone for at least 5 minutes when I heard Kenny's voice again off in the distance. Oddly enough, it wasn't in the direction they left in. "Did you forget something?" I called out to him. His voice came again, but I couldn't make out the words. It was coming from the direction of the lake, but he would have needed to walk through the campsite to be on that path. I stood up, straining to listen. I called out his name and took a few steps closer to the pathway heading to the lake. "Kenny, stop fooling around," I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. Did he take the long way around just to scare me? No, he hadn't been gone that long for him to be that far out. I took another step closer but stopped. This felt wrong. After those 4 people got lost in these woods, I decided I didn't want to go down a path alone. I went back to setting up the fire and getting dinner ready. If Kenny was playing a prank, he would get bored and come back. Oddly enough, my 3 friends came back together. "Did you see any other cars around?" I asked them, wondering if there had just been another camper out here that sounded like Kenny. "No, it's just us." "Why?" Mila asked, catching on something was bothering me. "I heard something while you guys were gone. It sounded human, but it's hard to say." Now I was doubting myself. Did that really sound like a voice? Or was it too far away to tell? "Probably a bird. Some of those loons or whatever they are sound spooky," Darren said with a shrug. He went out camping here pretty often. I accepted he knew what he was talking about and dismissed my concerns. We settled down to eat. The brothers gladly ate cans of beans as Mila and I stuck to hot dogs. The brothers also lit up an after-dinner treat. I didn't smoke, but Mila did on occasion. She passed that night. I think she didn't want to bring the smell into the shared tent. Kenny stood up to say he needed to use the washroom. It had gotten dark, so I found him a flashlight. I also needed to go. Then Darren stood up deciding he should go with us. And Mila didn't want to be left alone, so we all gathered for a bathroom break. It was a bit hard to focus on the task at hand, knowing Mila was so close by. I knew she had her back turned to us 3, as we took care of business, and yet it still took me the longest to finish. We scouted a good spot for her and gave Mila some privacy, but also kept scanning the trees in case a wild animal decided to suddenly appear. With all that taken care of, we were going to head back when an unnatural sound came from nearby. Something I never expected to ever hear while in a forest at night. A few feet away from us came the sound of a baby crying. I saw Kenny's pale face in the light of my flashlight. Darren silently shook his head as Mila stood frozen in place. I took a step closer to the source of the sound, and Darren's hand fell on my shoulder. "Fuck that," he whispered. I agreed and took a step back. We should all just leave. Mila, bless her, didn't want to risk someone actually being in trouble. She bravely marched off into the woods with 3 guys going after her, whispering for us to get out of there. We followed her to the source of the sound. She stopped just outside a small clearing with someone sitting on a log. They were dressed in rags with their back facing us. The figure hunched over, rocking back and forth as they made shushing sounds. We didn't hear the baby crying anymore. This was freaky. Downright nightmare fuel. "Are you all right?" Mila asked in a shaking voice. "My baby. My poor baby." The woman spoke, and she sounded so normal compared to how she looked. "We can call someone to get you some help," Mila offered. "My poor baby is starving." Slowly the figure turned its head. The light caught a set of gray eyes that reflected in our flashlights. Stringy gray hair fell over a pale face. At first, the expression was blank. Then the face transformed into something distorted and monstrous. Kenny and Darren were screaming before that creature stood up. They bolted, leaving Mila and me behind. I grabbed her wrist, forcing her to run as the pale creature screeched. It got on all fours to easily cross the cleaning to reach us. It jumped into the air, mouth open and bony clawed hands outwards. I pulled Mila out of the way in time. The monster crashed into a tree, then flipped around on the ground like a cat trying to right itself. We started running again. Mila's legs shook so much I ended up grabbing her around the waist to start dragging her. To my horror, the monster kept coming for us. I needed to fight back. I let go of her long enough to find a hefty stick to use as a weapon. That was a mistake, although I'm not sure if we had any chance of getting away unscathed. The pale creature came down on Mila, biting down hard on her hand. She screamed and kicked to get the thing away from her. I slammed the branch as hard as I could into the monster's face. It screeched and released my best friend. I kept hitting it, but I think I was just pissing it off. Just as it was about to go into a counterattack, a whistle came from somewhere. For some reason, the creature suddenly got on all fours, a look of distress on its face. It turned heel and darted back into the woods. To my horror, I saw another pale figure between the trees also take off running on all fours. I didn't care about the reason why they were leaving, only that we were safe for now. "How bad is it?" I asked Mila, turning all my attention to her. She shook her head with tears in her eyes. The bite wasn't as deep as I feared. We had a first aid kit back at camp. I took hold of her again to get us moving. I didn't hear Kenny or Darren. Even though they left us behind, I hoped they were safe. "It'll be all right. We'll get out of here. Do you have your phone?" I asked as we kept moving. Mila shook her head. I hadn't grabbed mine either. Sure, we were smart enough to go into a group, but we hadn't done anything intelligent after that. An odd whistling sound came through the trees. The strange melody chilled me to my core. Mila started to tug at my arm so we would walk away from the whistling. I glanced over her shoulder and saw flashes of white darting around the branches above us. As much as I hated the whistling, going in that direction seemed like the better option. Mila protested a little when I pulled on her arm to get us moving. I didn't want to scare her by telling her about the creatures stalking us in the trees. When I heard Kenny scream, I forgot about the threats we faced and ran in his direction. Hearing his voice was a good sign. I just hoped we reached him in time. We stumbled into another clearing. I raised the flashlight I somehow still held onto. The beam of light landed on a stranger's face. His left eye reflected the light, but his right eye didn't. His head was slightly titled, as if amused by our sudden appearance. My skin crawled seeing such a pleased smile after the terrifying encounter beforehand. Kenny was on the ground, breathing heavily with the man's foot on his chest. My friend also had a bite taken out of his arm that was freely bleeding. For a moment it appeared he had a bolt from a crossbow sticking out of his chest. I soon realized the bolt was stuck inside a pale monster beside him I didn't see at first. The stranger had a hunter's bow attached to his arm, loaded and ready to shoot. "What did you do to Kenny, and where is Darren?" I demanded with a trembling voice. The man licked his lips and lifted his foot off Kenny's chest. He brushed strands of dirty brown hair from his face only to have it fall back. "I just saved this one from being a midnight snack, and I sent the other one down the trail. He might not reach the end of it alone, though," the stranger said, and ended his sentence with a raspy laugh. He sounded as if he smoked a pack a day for most of his life. I didn't trust this guy. Mila tightened her grip on my arm, showing she felt the same way. "Two of you got bitten tonight. Bites can turn people into those things. The infected ones won't be able to stand the whistling." After the man spoke, he started whistling in a way that didn't sound human. It was as if a songbird was trying to imitate a man-made instrument. I hadn't been bitten that night, and yet the noise put me on edge. Kenny recovered enough to scramble away from the stranger. Mila didn't react aside from appearing as nervous as she did when we first stumbled onto this scene. Finally, the man finished whistling and then studied us all very carefully. He raised the crossbow and rested it on his shoulder. "The trail is just past those trees. You kids better get going home." A weight had been lifted off my chest. Aside from some minor injuries and a few scares, we were free to leave. Kenny was the first to get up. His legs shook as he tried to walk towards where we had been directed. Mila and I walked past the man, feeling his eyes on us. All the stress from the night came back as he gave us an unseen, judging stare. I thought we were in the clear when a sharp whistle came again. It was so sudden I jumped. Mila did as well. I turned around to comfort her, and what I saw caused my entire world to come crumbling down. Her face changed. The person I'd cared for so deeply and for so long looked nothing like herself. In her shock, she dropped her mask to let a contorted version of herself show through. When she realized her cover had been blown, her mouth grew wide and was suddenly filled with countless sharp teeth. She wanted to take my head off, but a quick shot from the crossbow stopped her. A bolt went through her cheeks, shattering teeth. She screamed, thrashing around. Before the man shot her again, she ripped the bolt from her face and jumped backward. Mila landed on all fours, snarling with a bloody mouth towards us. To my horror, a ripping sound came as she sprouted massive bat-like wings. Her hands became claws, and her face transformed into something so far from human that I almost doubted she had once been the friend I cared about. In a flash, she launched into the treetops, joining the other white creatures that watched the scene at a distance. It took me a long time to realize the stranger started to drag me away. My brain was so numb from shock I don't remember how long we walked on the trail, or what anyone said to me most of the way back. I knew that man was whistling again. I snapped, wanting the noise to end. He stopped for a few minutes, then I realized the noise was the only thing keeping those creatures away. He playfully started back up again as Kenny and I kept our heads forward, trying to ignore the horrors in the trees. Darren was waiting for us at the end of the trail and outside of the forest. A lone police officer stood next to him, face as cold as steel. We stopped in front of them, unsure of what to say or how to explain ourselves. "Did you take care of the problem?" the officer asked, almost sounding annoyed. "Problems? And nope. Too many of them to deal with and get these three out at the same time. I'm going back in to see what I can do. Sure do wish I had a friend coming with me," the stranger said with a loud, over-exaggerated sigh. I found my mouth opening to offer to go back to try and save Mila, but the cop stopped me. He saw 3 scared kids who would die if they tried to fight some monsters in a dark forest. "None of that. This is your job, not theirs. Now go and do it while I take care of my duties." The man shrugged again and pulled something out of his pocket. I expected it to be a pack of cigarettes, but he opened a small jar of dried cinnamon sticks. He tried offering one to Kenny, who refused. I reached out to take one, not to start chewing on like he did, but I needed something real from that night or else my brain wouldn't believe what happened. "This one is bitten. Do you have anything for him?" the officer asked, and the stranger shook his head. Without warning, the cop pulled out a packaged syringe with some sort of clear mystery liquid inside. Kenny didn't protest the shot. The officer then reached into his back pocket to pull out 3 folded pieces of paper. "Sign these statements. The story is your friend got up in the middle of the night and got lost. We'll search for her tomorrow," the cop said and handed us a sheet of paper. Darren looked disgusted, but he signed his name. Kenny needed some prodding to do the same. I refused, and it made the officer glare daggers in my direction. "What if I tell a different story?" I threatened, ready to face whatever retaliation that might happen. "You can. I say it would be best for you mentally to get the real story out, but no one will believe you. As it is, people are going to assume you 3 did something to that girl. Don't make it harder on yourself. the stranger said as he rolled the cinnamon around between his teeth. I hated him. I hated myself, and I hated what happened. I signed the paper, and the officer told us to get inside his car so he could take us to the station. He made us repeat the same fake story a few dozen times. As we drove off, I looked out the back window to see the stranger giving us a sarcastic wave, and I saw the lights of the car being reflected by so many eyes watching in the trees. There was a search for Mila, but nothing turned up. People have whispered about what happened. None of it is even close to the truth. Kenny and Darren started to stay inside and away from accusing stares. I've heard they're not as close as they were before. I've started saving up as much as I can to move away. There is nothing left for me in this place aside from bad memories. I don't know if that man hunted down all the monsters lurking in the woods and deep down. I hope he didn't kill the thing Mila turned into. Twisted or not, I wanted a part of her to live on no matter how selfish it was. I need to leave this place. I found myself wanting to go back to those woods to try to find her, and that desire scared me. The real Mila would want me to live, and that is what I'm going to try to do.
How to survive camping. Don't try to do my job.
I run a private campground. It has been passed down for generations, which has turned it old and made it a haven for the inhuman things of the world to lair in. The creatures that have hunted humanity for generations are drawn to this place, for the cumulative history of this land whispers to them and invites them home. New creatures, too, find haven here, a respite from the struggle to survive in a world that they don't quite belong in yet. But now I am told the land is becoming ancient, a nexus of lore and age, a wellspring of potential, and whatever lays claim to it can shape it to their will, for good or ill. There are many ancient places in our world. They belong to gods and demons, and all the great and terrible things we tell ourselves are mere figments of the past, so that we can sleep better at night. My land knows otherwise. Also, we let people camp here. If you're new here, you should really start at the beginning, and if you're totally lost, this might help. Thanksgiving is going to be uncomfortable this year. I called up a family meeting to discuss the ancient land problem, and it was the most unproductive meeting I've ever run in my life. Normally, I try to keep things moving and cut off unproductive conversations, but people would just not move on. In retrospect, perhaps I should have handled it differently. Tossed, "The land is turning ancient," in like a hand grenade, and then dismissed the meeting for a week to let everyone digest it. Instead, I gave them that update at the beginning, and then naively tried to move on to my proposal on how to handle it, and we spent 2 hours in what I can only describe as hand-wringing, navel-gazing denial. None of them want to accept that the land is turning ancient. They questioned my sources, insisted that Bo was lying to me even though I don't think he's ever lied to me. And then we got stuck on why the lady with the extra eyes had to die for a while, and finally it all broke down when someone remarked that maybe if I weren't such an asshole, I could have resolved things peacefully. I lost my temper after that, told them that I owned the land. I was the reason none of them had to live in the main house with the little girl and the beast waiting for their blood every night, and that the land is turning ancient, and that this was how I decided to handle it. The last 15 minutes of the meeting was spent with me outlining the plan to a room full of hostile silence, and then I dismissed the meeting because it was clear no one was going to provide productive commentary. Holding meetings is hard, y'all. It's even harder when you've got some kind of blood relationship with everyone in the room. Oh yes, I guess we're calling the man with the skull cup Bo now. Thanks for giving me something I can barely type. I've had to put a sticky note on my laptop. I'm not sure if it's his name, but maybe if we just all go along with it, it'll become his name. I don't have a better plan. Anyway, my brother wasn't at the family meeting. I called him after and told him the gist of the plan. 2 days later, he invited me over for dinner, so I got to see my niece. That was cool. And his wife was there, and while I was holding my niece, she went for the throat. "You have to make this work," she said. "You have to make the land safe. For her." I told her I would. I didn't tell her, or anyone, that the final step to this is that I die. It's a sobering thing to think about. picking your death. I've always assumed it would someday be the beast. I see it in my nightmares, when the thing in the dark passes by and we all dream of what lives within its heart. Such an easy decision, when the only consequence was my own cessation. Fight until that inevitable misstep. The land cannot go to the beast. A creature of inescapable death cannot become an ancient thing. There is enough cruelty in this world already. So I have to choose. And while I have no intention of giving up until I am satisfied with the life I've lived, I am also practical enough to consider a backup plan, in case I don't get my wish. I'm not sure who I'd pick, if I had to choose right now. I don't trust Bo quite yet. The fairy seems uninterested and their fondness for hunting concerns me. I have enough alcohol-related problems already that the dancers seem like a poor choice. The visitor from rule number 1 wouldn't be that bad of a pick. I could think of worse things to govern this land than hospitality laws. The master of the gray world is also on my list, though I wonder if it isn't an ancient thing already. The entity that shows up when a relative dies seems benevolent, so it might also be an option, but I have no way to get it to show up other than murder a relative, which really isn't feasible. Though after the disastrous family meeting, I gotta admit that it's tempting. I admit I'm kind of in a murderous mood this week, and it was really hard to not do something awful because A, it would fix the problem, and B, if I'm interpreting Perchta's message right then, that stitch isn't holding me back anymore. It starts with someone that has clearly read my posts. If you're reading this one, you know who you are, and I hate you. On the whole, the people who camp here are decent folks. I'm sure I might think otherwise if I got to know them better, but the majority are all right. I've probably given you all a slanted view of my campers because I only talk about the worst of them. For instance, the kind that feel they are somehow smart enough to get away with anything. The sort you look at and think that, ah yes, this is someone that needs a swift punch to the teeth by Madame Consequences. Around here, she wears brass knuckles. While our big events are all done with, we're getting an influx of people on our open camping weekends, which are every weekend now, while the weather is nice. We should finish the season with just enough money to get us through the winter. Obviously, I really need things to go well between now and when winter hits. So when someone decided to help out by taking matters into their own hands, I was pretty displeased. I got a call over the radio from one of my staff. They sounded terrified, which was alarming as this wasn't one of my seasonal hires. It was a full-timer. My full-timers are reliable folks. It takes a bit to rattle them. Someone tried to drive off the children, they said. I've had some camps yell at the children with no wagon before. They don't react. It takes either persistent refusals or ignoring them to get them to leave. This individual threw a bucket of water on them, my employee said, and the children had screamed like banshees and fled, shrieking the whole way down the road until they vanished out of sight. I told my employee to stay put. I'd be right there to talk to the person responsible. He was camping alone, his tent located at the edge of the deep woods and far from other people. I will refrain from describing the individual because I don't want to start a witch hunt. Suffice to say that he had a punchable face. I know that I was biased at the time, but I really do think you'd agree with me. He had the kind of face that just begs for a black eye and a broken nose. I kept my temper in check and asked what the hell he was doing and why I shouldn't evict him from the campground right then and there. Oh yeah, well, I read your posts and I figured if the children were unbaptized undead or something, then maybe a bit of holy water would get rid of them. He sounded rather pleased with himself. My temper snapped. I think I said something about how he was to pack his shit and get off my land, only with a lot more profanity, and then I stalked away before I did something really regrettable. I almost made it to my four-wheeler before my mind calmed enough to come up with a rational, better idea than mere eviction. I turned around and went back to where he stood forlornly by his tent, apparently confused as to why I wasn't thanking him for his assistance. I stalked right past him, stuck my head in his tent, and swiped his car keys before he could realize what was happening. I dangled them in front of me. He took a step towards them and I fixed him with a stare intended to remind him that I had killed people for less, and I would do the same to him if he tried anything else. "These stay with me," I said. You get them back when you pacify the children with no wagon. You caused this problem, so now you get to figure it out. But don't whine to me, I snapped. You were clever enough to figure out the holy water, right? So now you get to figure out this problem. He followed me to my four-wheeler, protesting the whole way. Didn't I see how they ran off? It had worked, obviously, right? I ignored him and left him to contemplate his bad decisions. Then he showed up at my office like 2 hours later. The children were still around, he said nervously. They were following him. I said that yes, of course they were, and that he'd better figure something out before they skinned him alive or something like that. The nice thing about him having read my posts is that I don't have to pretend to be nice. That thing with your great-uncle giving them candy, would that work? He finally asked. Did you miss the part where I said my uncle embellished his stories? I snapped. Why don't you try it and see what happens? Which is really the polite way of saying, fuck around and find out. So I guess while I wasn't the one doing the murdering, I really wasn't trying very hard to keep him alive either. He went to the camp store and bought a bag of saltwater taffy. Bad choice. And then someone found him a few hours later, staggering down the road, mouth agape, skin turning faintly blue. The paramedics have a good response time to our campground, for obvious reasons, so they got here in time to clear the mass of taffy that had been shoved down his esophagus and restore oxygen before he died. Which is a bit of a pity, because it would have nicely solved the problem. Or maybe not. They were pretty pissed off about the holy water. Anyway, the hospital cleared him for release and I was there in the parking lot to pick him up. The hospital staff have learned to look the other way when I show up to the hospital with my shotgun. I always have a very good reason. On the drive back to the campground, I explained through clenched teeth that buying ice from them was an invitation to do mischief on the campground. Mischief that, according to the other inhabitants, would escalate into violence. What he had done was attack them. They were angry. They needed appeasement. Then I dropped him off at his campground and went to do more important things, like review the registration of everyone on my land to figure out how long they were staying. I admit that I had some ulterior motives for keeping that idiot around. If the children with no wagon were preoccupied with tormenting him, then perhaps they'd leave everyone else alone long enough for them to pack up and go home, blissfully unaware of the danger they were in. Turns out it worked. Around midnight, I got a call on my phone via the emergency number. Any guesses who it was? Anyone? They're outside my tent, he whispered frantically. That's great, I replied, and then I hung up. I tried to go back to sleep. I really did. But I guess I've got a conscience now. I blame all of you. And it might not be that strong, but it tries its best. And I just couldn't sleep because I kept thinking of what could happen if the children got done tormenting him and went after the rest of the campsite. I got out of bed and went to the garage. I didn't even bother to get dressed. I reserve the courtesy of pants for people that haven't pissed me off. This guy got the privilege of dealing with an angry Kate in pajamas. Not many people have reached the point where they've used up all my fucks, and I have none left to give them. I drove out there and stopped the four-wheeler along the road. The children were gathered around his tent, which glowed from within from the light of a LED lantern. I could see the outline of the camper, huddled in the middle of his tent. Around the nylon structure were the children, holding hands and walking in a slow circle around it. They were singing, "Ring Around the Rosie," I think. Their laughter sounded like the shrieks of hyenas when they got to the end and fell down. I'm not sure if that's an inhuman trait or just what children sound like. I called him back on my cell phone. "Yeah, I'm at your campsite," I said. "They're not bothering anyone else." "But what about me?" he said wildly, clearly frightened. "They've been doing this for hours." "I don't know," I replied. "You're out of holy water, aren't you? I guess you're in for a bad night." Then I hung up and left. Harsh? Yes. Look, I find people largely tolerable on good days. My interactions with my campers are brief, and so I don't get to know them well enough to learn their annoying quirks. The rest of the time I'm dealing with people that are either complaining to me or causing problems for me. I don't really have any patience left for someone that decides to do the supernatural equivalent of using gasoline to combat a forest fire. I did try at least one thing to help the situation, only because it was conveniently on the way. My route home took me past the thing in the dark. I haven't talked to it since the branch incident. Honestly, I've been a bit afraid to. It seems to have made a bargain with me, as it let me leave with the branch, but I've been nervous that I may be mistaken, or it might have a timeline in mind for when I must return to the gray world. It's an irrational fear, if my ancestors' death is any indication, as they lived for many years after they killed the First Lady with extra eyes. But I feel a little paranoia is warranted, right? I have left it offerings, food, drink, flowers, small trees. I just kind of dropped them and run. They've all vanished, so I think that means they were accepted, but I'm not sure if that means I'm forgiven. Perhaps it was the lack of sleep from being woken so late at night, but that was the moment I decided to find out. I left my four-wheeler on the road a healthy distance away from the thing in the dark's mound. I really don't have money left in the budget for another one. I tentatively crept up to the pile of debris, every nerve in me screaming that I should flee at the slightest movement. I can understand why the senior campers swear that the mound breathes. My mind was racing with adrenaline, and for a moment I thought I'd hallucinated that exact thing, that the mound had shifted, and I froze like a mouse hiding from the hawk, my gaze fixed on the pile of sticks and leaves, not even blinking. Only when I convinced myself that it was my imagination did I continue forwards until I was at a respectful distance in which to hold a conversation. "So the children are angry again," I said. "I've asked you about them before and you told me to remove the person that started it. But I was thinking maybe I'd try something different this time. Could I remove the children instead?" Nothing. I waited for a minute and then a minute more, and finally the quiet of the forest started to get to my nerves, and I felt it was really best if I just left. The forest shouldn't be this quiet at night anyway. It was a bad sign. Perhaps because the children were angry and released from whatever holds them in check, or perhaps something worse was nearby. Either way, best if I got to the safety of my house. I turned to go. "You can't," the thing in the dark rumbled, as soon as I had turned my back. The ground beneath me lurched and then softened to a faint trembling as its voice quieted. "I'm sorry?" I asked, not turning around. "The children." It sounded like a sigh, and this time the ground barely stirred beneath my feet. I thought that was rather considerate of it and felt a pang of guilt for stealing that branch. "So, I can't get rid of them?" "You can't." I cursed under my breath. The thing in the dark has been a reliable source of information, so when it says I can't get rid of the children, I'm inclined to believe it. I mentally slated that as a problem for another day. Perhaps they couldn't be removed, but they might be able to be contained, or reduced to a less dangerous state. "Hey, I just wanted to say," I said, "about the branch." It was my intention to apologize. However, it seemed the thing in the dark was having none of that, for it interrupted me mid-sentence with a dull rumble that sounded like an avalanche of gravel tumbling towards me. "Leave!" the thing in the dark bellowed, and the ground rose up beneath me, throwing me bodily forwards and almost pitching me face first into the ground. I'm going, I shrieked as I caught my balance, and then I hauled ass back to the road. So I guess it is angry at me. Good to know. It wasn't too long before I realized that I was being followed. I let up on the gas so that the engine noise subsided. The unnatural silence of the forest made it easier to hear the giggling that came from the trees around me. I cursed under my breath. The laughter of children seemed that they weren't entirely occupied with their chosen prey and were willing to pursue a more interesting victim. Or perhaps it was the bad year that motivated them, an unconscious desire to kill me that they didn't fully understand. Or maybe they're just assholes. They're undead demon children after all. I floored the gas on the four-wheeler, thankful that I knew this road well enough to dodge the potholes even in the dark. I had no desire to find out firsthand what kind of mischief the children were up to tonight. I don't know the full abilities of the children. I only have a theory of what they even are. I think we're very, very lucky that it takes a precipitating event to release their power upon my land. I was seized by hands, dozens of invisible hands, closing on my shoulders and arms, wrapping fingers through my ponytail. They yanked backwards, pulling me off the back of the four-wheeler, and I landed hard on my back, stunned by surprise. It had been so sudden. I'd barely had time to register that anything was touching me. Then they began to drag me backwards, down the road and towards the darkness of the trees. Meanwhile, my four-wheeler continued blithely on, expending the rest of its momentum until it veered off into the ditch and hit a tree. I think this says a lot about my priorities, but the main thought in my head as that invisible presence dragged me backwards along the road was how much was left in the budget for four-wheeler maintenance. It's not totaled, at least. I took it to someone in town that works on cars. They think they can fix it. Then I was being dragged through the woods and I twisted, trying to flip over onto my back. I shielded my face with one arm and reached for my knife with the other. My fingers closed over the hilt and I drew, flailing wildly with the blade at whatever held me. The knife only met empty air, and the laughter of the children all around me echoed in my ears, mocking my futile struggles. A sharp jerk pulled me up into the air by my ponytail. I screeched in pain and kicked wildly, heart pounding, and I slashed back and forth, up and around, trying to connect with anything. Then something slapped my hand, something immense and strong, and the knife was knocked out of my grip and it tumbled off into the forest somewhere. I haven't found it yet. I got my staff and we scoured that entire area and still didn't find it. I'm conflicted about how I feel about this. Granted, it's about the only weapon I've got for when guns don't work, but it was also made out of my great aunt. So, maybe it's time I find a different weapon. I don't know. Seriously, don't hassle me about this in the comments. I haven't actually given up on finding it. The children tied me to a tree branch with my ponytail. I swear I about blacked out when they let go, and it was only my hair holding me up. The jerk sent agony through my skull, and for a moment it was like the world went dark, and then I was thrashing on instinct, until my hands slapped against the bark of the branch, and I was able to relieve some of the pressure on my hair. Beneath me, the children joined hands and began to circle. They sang. It was not "Ring Around the Rosie." It was a song of their own invention. Our mothers buried us deep, so her secrets we will keep. Bring us a blanket, made from the flesh of man, under which we can sleep, for our mothers buried us deep. I remember the warning from Bo. He warned me, after we cut down the people the children had left hanging in the trees, that next time it'd be just their skins that we found. Blankets made from the flesh of humankind. I held very still, my arms trembling with the effort of holding myself aloft enough to keep my weight off my hair. Slowly, trying to not attract their attention, I lifted a leg and hooked it over the branch. Then another. Just enough to stabilize myself so that I could remain there until they left. Which wasn't until dawn. And that whole time I was clinging to that branch, shaking, hoping that they had no intention of carrying through with their promise of skinning someone alive because I had no weapon and was tethered very firmly in place. It was a long night of contemplating my own mortality and cursing the irony that landed me in this position. But dawn came and they ran off into the woods, giggling like this was just the best game. And I guess it was, for them. They left me hanging there by my knees and hands, my hair firmly knotted around the branch. One of my staff, making the mid-morning round around the campground, found me and was able to help get my hair untangled. They cut the branch, and once I was on the ground, we were able to get me loose. It was worse than the time someone stuck bubble gum in my hair in 4th grade. It wasn't until noon that I got back to my house and got myself cleaned up. I'd just stepped out of the shower when my phone started ringing. It was the camper. "You had better have solved this," I said through clenched teeth. "I did," he replied. "I thought about what you said about appeasement, and I got them a gift and they seemed really happy with it. I bought them a wagon." "You did what?" I screamed into the phone. For a moment I stood there, seething with blind fury, and struggled to find the right words that would convey that anger in a way he'd understand the full weight of it. While screaming nigh incoherent profanity can be cathartic, It's not a very good way to communicate that I had told him to fix the situation, not to save his own skin and make it worse for everyone else. Also, I told one of your staff that I'd lost my keys and someone had returned them, and I was supposed to pick them up from your office, but that you weren't in at the moment, so they helpfully got them for me. I'm miles from the campsite and I'm never coming back." He hung up. I didn't want to throw my cell phone at the wall because those things are expensive, so I went outside and angrily chopped firewood for a while. I should have enough to last me until spring. I'm tempted to pull the wagons from the camp store, but I think that might be a little too spiteful. I'm a campground manager. I'm starting to regret these posts, both because they're turning my land ancient and also because they've apparently given some people ideas. When this all started, I thought that if people knew, if they were educated, then perhaps the world would be a little bit safer. I don't know. The numbers actually are better this year, despite everything that's happened. Maybe that's because of these posts, or maybe it's because everything is trying to kill me instead of the people that camp here. I guess it can't be helped. What's done is done. I just have to keep moving forwards. I'm not changing the rule about the children. I've had to reprint the pamphlets twice now, and the camping season is getting close to an end. The children still have their creepy stares to scare people off, and people tend to not buy ice this time of year anyway. I'll just get a bunch of cheap flyers to hand to people with their registration warning them not to buy ice from children at all. Maybe next year the children won't be around. I know what the thing in the dark said, but I'm still going to search for some way to deal with them. On my office wall is a list. It has all the entities on my land that are a threat to humankind. I hung a red marker next to it so that I can cross them out once they've been eliminated. The family meeting was to decide how to handle each of them. It breaks tradition. We've never tried to fight these things. Doing so invites disaster. That's what my family said. Screw tradition. This land is turning ancient and everything is changing. It's a long list, but I think I know where to start. I need to talk to Bo. X.